Well, it's a great pleasure to be here to this inaugural meeting, which I gather I have the great privilege of being the first speaker. Can I ask you a question before I start? Is there anyone here who's never heard of Theosophy? One. And anyone who's never heard of the Theosophical Society? Who's never heard of the Theosophical Society? Oh, three. So I'll have to try and steer a sort of balance between people who are coming at it fresh and people who I've seen many times before at meetings and who've heard me speak many times and who probably know as much Theosophy, if not more than I do. So it's going to be quite difficult to steer a course between it all. Now, one or two things about the Theosophical Society to start with. It's founded in 1875 by two people, Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott. And they founded this society because Madame Blavatsky had spent most of her life travelling the world, studying the different world religions and different philosophies, and she had become aware, as she did this, that there was a sort of golden thread of fundamental truth underlying most of the religions and philosophies of the world. And it was this golden thread, as it were, which she wanted to bring to the attention of the world because she saw it as a great unifying factor. And so she founded the society to be this sort of spearhead of a unifying factor which would get rid of all the antagonism and hatred that seems to exist between people of different religions and different philosophies, and I guess more wars and hatred has been generated over religion perhaps than over politics. It's a terrible thing. It should never have happened. It should never be happening. And we get it in our own generation, in our own age. We've had it in our own country this year. This antagonism because of religious orientation, most of which is acquired in childhood anyway, and not as a result of deep intellectual searching at all. So she started off this society, and the first thing to do was to have some sort of object for the society. Why have the society? And the first object is to form a nucleus of universal brotherhood of mankind, without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste or colour. And then the second object is to study comparative religion, philosophy and science. We don't put on any blinkers or pretend things don't exist, which do exist in the world of philosophy. We look at the whole scene and try and establish where the truth is in that scene. And finally, there's the esoteric side, the deeply esoteric side, to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in man. And of course, the unexplained laws of nature are vast. We may feel we've achieved a lot with modern science. We've only really scratched the surface of nature, and the arguments and puzzles which nature presents to the scientists of our generation are just as big and great as they have been to our forefathers in science. And the powers latent in man are also most extraordinary. Man seems to have an almost infinite capacity for complexity, and the studies in psychology and brain research and so on and do nothing but deepen the mystery of man's consciousness. And as you know, science again is very, very taken up with the whole question of consciousness and what it is and how it arises out of ordinary plain physical matter in such a deep and penetrating form as we have it ourselves in our human lives. Most extraordinary. So those three objects, and you can see, provide a very, very fertile field upon which to generate study and discussion and have talks. And the Society has used this field for the last 100 and something years to great effect to run its meetings and provide interest to people. And most important of all, to provide people with an understanding of what life is all about. People are really asking the question. And if people aren't asking the question now, they're going to ask it sometime in their lives. What is my life all about? Why am I here? What am I doing here? Am I just living an animal sort of existence, or is there some deep purpose behind my living this human life? And Theosophy comes with a whole series of answers to these questions, which are quite different and far more radical and far-reaching and penetrating than anything that has ever been offered up by any of the world religions. So there is the picture that, and the sort of agenda which the Theosophical Society works upon. Now you'll see it as this talk progresses this evening that the number of things that the Society puts forward as ideas for consideration are pretty incompatible with some religious teaching and some theologies of some of the world religions and Christianity as well. So there has been a sort of uncomfortable balance between Christianity in particular and the Theosophical teachings, because the Theosophical teachings, as you'll see, are much wider than Christian theology. And as I spent most of my life in the Anglican Church and leading Bible study groups and as church counsellor and synod members and goodness knows what else, I studied the Bible from my youth in great depth. I have a very interesting and fascinating comparison in my own mind between what Blavatsky's theology is like and what Christian theology is like as presented by the Church of England. So this all goes to add to the richness of the teaching that we have. Now, one thing I want to say at the very outset of this talk is that I totally abhor dogma. And people say, well, what is dogma? Now, I define dogma as teaching which is required as an essential part of anyone's membership of anything. If you belong to anything, and you're required to agree that you accept certain pieces of teaching before you're allowed to join that society or that religion or that church or whatever it is, that is dogma. Otherwise, it's doctrine. If it's there presented to you, you can consider it, you can think about it, you can agree with it partially and not wholly, or not agree with it at all, but still belong. Then that's doctrine, that's not dogma. But dogma I intensely dislike because it's almost a form of blackmail. You want to belong? Right, then you have to believe this, and don't you dare not believe it, you see. And this is the way the world's religions have gone on. If you don't believe this, you can't belong to our religion. Many people, of course, in the Middle Ages were excommunicated, even burnt at the stake, because they weren't prepared to accede to all the dogmatic teaching of the Roman Church. So it's big stuff. It's a big stick, and it's been used a great deal down through history to control people and to make people believe things that they are not particularly inclined to believe. Now, Theosophy does not in any way go down this path. In fact, it abhors it. Theosophy says any teaching that we put forward for consideration is only for consideration. There's nothing in the three objects that I just mentioned which has got anything to do with dogma. Those are the objects, they're the things that that's the agenda that we set ourselves in running the society. All the doctrine that I'm going to put over, or ideas that I'm going to put over this evening, are there for your consideration. Not that you have to believe any of it or accept any of it. You still belong to the Theosophical Society if you don't agree with anything that I say this evening, because we don't have anything in the form of dogma. Now, apart from the three objects, Blavatsky brought up something else, which is I call the three fundamental rocks upon which is built the whole structure of Theosophical teaching. And these three fundamental rocks are called the three fundamental propositions. And I'm sure virtually everyone here has heard of her book, The Secret Doctrine, because it gets talked about under all sorts of guises and all sorts of occasions. It's secret not because you can't go to any library and order it if they haven't got it on the bookshelf, or go to any bookseller and buy it. It's plenty of it is available. But the reason it's secret is that to penetrate into the depth of understanding of the teachings that are in the secret doctrine is a whole lifetime's work, and it's secret to the extent that it's very difficult to penetrate into the teachings. Anyway, in the proem to the secret doctrine, she, towards the end, really, if you never read the secret doctrine, I plead with everybody in this room to read the proem to the secret doctrine, because for me it was an absolute flash of excitement and understanding of a whole width of teaching and thought that I'd never even considered in my whole life before when I read the proem to the secret doctrine. And it's the most fantastic, it runs to many pages of the first volume. And at the very end of this proem, she puts forward these three fundamental propositions. And in a way, in this talk this evening, which I haven't even started yet, I'm dealing with some aspect of each of these three objects, three fundamental propositions. I won't read them to you now because they're a tremendous mouthful, but I will bring them out as and when necessary in the course of the talk. Now, it's the third object, the third fundamental proposition, which is the one that contains this idea of karma. Perhaps I will read it to you, the third one. The fundamental identity of all souls with the universal oversoul, and the obligatory pilgrimage for every soul through the cycle of incarnation or necessity, in accord with cyclic and karmic law. Now, it's this karmic law, those last two words of this proposition, which I'm going to spend the first half of my talk considering, because this particular teaching is absolutely fundamental to our whole attitude to life, to our ideas about God, and about culpability and all the things that might arise from the way we decide to live our lives. And it starts off with this deceptively simple little word, three-letter word, law. You know, and I find the English language absolutely fascinating, because even with this incredible vocabulary that we have in English, we can take a little three-letter word like that and give it three fundamentally different meanings. And I just want to very briefly look at the three meanings of this little word law. Because first of all, we have the civil law. Now, the civil law, as we all know, is transacted by Acts of Parliament, which determine the way in which we agree democratically to live together in society. And we transact most of them in Parliament, some of them we transact locally in our local communities. And this is something we agree to do. We set it up. And if you live in a different part of the country, you may find some of the local laws, civil laws, are different from other parts of the country. And it's certainly, if you go to a different country from England, you may find quite a lot of laws are different from the ones that we have set up in Parliament in London. So civil law is obviously very much man-made and created just out of the sheer necessity of controlling the way in which we interact with each other as we live together in community. Then there's the moral law. The moral law is a bit more complex and a bit more subtle, because that seems to arise out of some sort of hangover of religious beliefs and practice that has been carried down from one generation to another. And even the moral law tends to change with time. The attitude towards sex, towards religion, towards marriage and all that sort of thing, it changes. And we've seen it change enormously, haven't we, most of us, in our lifetimes, the attitude towards morals. What was totally unacceptable in my childhood and youth, it seems to be completely acceptable in today's world in some respects, particularly to do with sex and living together before marriage and all that sort of thing. So moral law is quite variable. It has got its hard points. I mean, most people, I think all sane, sensible people realise that there are some things in the moral law which are absolutely, totally and utterly non-negotiable, like murder. and stealing. But the others are tend to be subject to a certain degree of fashion and change. And then we come on to this third law, the third meaning of the word law, which is the one that is really important as far as this evening is concerned, and that is the scientific law. These are laws that man has actually put together and constructed as a result of studying nature. Because whatever else you study, in order to try and find out the truth of existence and why we're here and everything else, that there isn't anywhere you can go more reliably than to nature. Nature has been there for thousands of years. It works automatically without our involvement, and we actually see the processes of nature working their way out absolutely, totally reliably and consistently from day to day and season to season. And this law, this law of nature, this scientific law that we discover, these laws we discover of nature, like gravity and electromagnetism and so on, and laws of chemistry, these are absolutely, totally different from the other two types of laws I've been mentioning, because these laws are absolutely, totally immutable and unchanging, completely. They're so reliable that we haven't got any doubt at all that as we walk down the stairs or climb onto a bus, that the force of gravity is going to hold us down and we're not going to float away into the atmosphere. And we don't even think about it. We flick on the electric light switch and we don't even give a thought to the fact that the laws of electromagnetism might not be operating just at this particular moment and the light won't come on for that reason. Don't even consider it, do we? We don't even consider when we put our key in the ignition of our car that the petrol won't ignite when the spark goes into the sparking plug in the engine, because we know the laws of chemistry are absolutely, totally reliable. Every second, every microsecond of every minute of time. And these scientific laws that have been discovered by man, because they're so reliable, they represent a sort of rock upon which to build. And modern science has really used these laws as rocks upon which to build a firm structure of scientific thought and practice. And the law of karma, we're told, falls into this category. Totally non-negotiable, totally non-changing and immutable. And because the law of karma is immutable and unchanging, we can't really do anything about it. It's been described in all sorts of ways. It's been described as the law of evolution, the law of innate intelligence, all these things that we tend to think had a degree of uncertainty about them are said in the teachings of Theosophy to be absolutely, totally immutable. And in the Mahatma letters, which are a source book of Theosophical teaching, I won't go into all the history of the Mahatma letters now, but they were written some time after Blavatsky's death, and they marry up with Blavatsky's teaching absolutely spot on all the way through. We have one of the writers saying that, referring to the law of karma as that terrible law, because you cannot escape it. It is absolutely inescapable. You know, if you commit a crime in England, you stand a reasonable chance, only a chance, but you stand a reasonable chance you might get away with it, if you're clever and you avoid leaving trails for the police to catch on to. But this law of karma is utterly and completely inescapable, just like the scientific laws. There's no way that any of you, by any force of your mind, can defeat the law of gravity and lift off your seat as you're sitting here this evening, because these laws are absolutely, totally immutable and unchanging. And this is the beginning of an insight into the nature of retribution. Now, retribution is a nasty word. People don't like the thought of retribution. You know, it has this sting about it of judgment and penalty and punishment and all these nasty things that people don't really want to think about in their lives. But and of course the Christian religion has suggested that by certain believing in Jesus, and by believing in his death upon the cross, you can somehow escape some of the consequences that might arise out of your bad actions. You could be forgiven. And this creates a considerable tension between Christianity and the Theosophical teachings, which say, no, it's not really like that at all. You do certain things and you create a certain response. You throw a pebble into the pool and you create certain waves due to the force of the pebble and how big the pebble is. Those waves are going to be a certain size and you can't do anything about it. And just as the waves caused by the pebble in the pool are totally uncontrollable in how big they are or how fast they are, because they're following natural laws, so are the laws of karma. Well, if that was all there was to say on the subject, it would be a pretty disappointing talk, but in fact it's a good deal more complicated than that, because the law of karma runs right through the piece. And when I say it runs right through the piece, I mean it runs through all different levels, not just our physical actions, but all our thoughts and attitudes as well. So you see, when let's take the example of someone who has committed some terrible aggravated burglary, and they come up before the court, and the judge says to the jury, what have you decided, guilty or not guilty? And the foreman of the jury stands up and says, guilty, my lord. And the man in the dock often is said by the reporters in the newspaper to have shown no emotion whatsoever, be totally indifferent, to have no appearance of remorse or regret that he's behaved in the way that he has. And well, he's being sent to prison, but then he expected to be sent to prison. He's got used to the idea of going to prison. But it's the lack of remorse, and often the judge comments on it. And there are other occasions when the person is obviously totally full of remorse, and the judge says, well, I'm not going to punish you as much, I'm not going to give you such a long sentence, because I can see you've been punished already by the amount of suffering you have yourself endured because you regretted what you did so much. Now, the law of karma is not being affected, is not being transgressed in any way by the fact that the judge has given a lower penalty to the man who is remorseful and regretful. Because, you see, karma acts at all sorts of different levels. And to repent of doing something wrong is highly karmic. It has a huge karmic impact upon the penalty that would otherwise have been due to you for some bad action. And a lot of people don't realise this, and they begin to think that that this law of karma is something that you just inevitably carry because of the physical side, but it's all the mental side as well. And so I'm going to bring you to a thought, which I bet the majority of you, unless some of you have heard this lecture before, you haven't actually heard this idea, that karma is hierarchical. Karma is hierarchical. Now, what do I mean by karma being hierarchical? Well, when you do something that's directly your own action without anyone else being involved, you generate karma for yourself and for nobody else perhaps, but perhaps you do because it has a sideways effect on members of your family, but you direct it for yourself. But if you're a member of your family and someone else in the family does something wrong, and you're affected by it, you suffer, but it's not because you've done something wrong, it's someone else. So it's another level of action that's taking place here. Take the case of a man, perhaps he's got a good job, and he's trusted by his employer to look after the money and so on and so forth, and he's got a wife and family and a mortgage, and everything is going well, and he sees an opportunity to embezzle some of his employer's money, and he gets found out, and the employer reports him to the police, and he gets tried and imprisoned, and there's no money to pay the mortgage, the family is thrown out of the house, which is repossessed, children have to go into bed and breakfast, and the whole thing collapses. Now, the wife and the children had no direct involvement in this embezzlement, in my example, but they suffered. And when this nation goes to war, particularly if it's a major war like the Second World War, the First World War, the whole nation suffers. There may be many people in the nation who don't want the war, who don't want to go to war. There were thousands marched through London who didn't want to go to war in Iraq recently. But you're part of the nation, so whether you like it or not, and whether you've protested by marching through London or not, you still have your life affected. I mean, I was a child in the Second World War, and I can remember how entirely different life was during the war, how different the whole attitude of society was, how so many things were in short supply or not available at all, and how everything was geared, all thought was about the war and the war effort, and the whole nation was changed by the fact that it was a war. But individuals may have had no involvement in the starting of that war or even in the running of that war, but they were involved because they belonged to the same nation. So when you look at someone, and of course the classic example of misunderstanding the law of karma is Glenn Hoddle some years ago, when he made this, was alleged to have made this remark about people in wheelchairs must have done something terribly wrong in this life or previous one in order to be in a wheelchair, and completely missed the point, because they may be in a wheelchair because someone else was a drunken driver and crashed into their car and broke their spine. And it was nothing to do with them, their karma at all. They were actually the victim of someone else's stupidity and selfishness. So you have to take on board this idea of a hierarchical karma, that things that happen to you, things that you suffer, may be due to your own deliberate fault, but they may not. They may be simply because you're involved with a family, in a certain family or in a certain community or in a certain nation. And certainly if global warming goes on and the ice caps melt and the sea level rises by 30 metres or whatever it's supposed to rise by, and half the world's major cities get engulfed by the sea, then that will be a world karma of some considerable impact. So there may be people who drown and suffer as a result of that, who've never burnt petrol or oil, who've never run a car, but they're still going to suffer just the same way because they're part of the world karma. So it is terribly important to understand that this karma works in this particular way, and that we can't necessarily analyse anybody's life and say what they're suffering is due to their own deliberate fault, or even in this life or in a previous life. And then there's the positive side of karma. And this is where the Theosophical message becomes very much more practical and less theoretical. Because Blavatsky used to say that the alternative word for Theosophy was altruism. The deliberate doing of good things to other people with no hope of a reward, or no intention of even expecting a reward, pure out of pure goodness and loving kindness to do things for other people. That is a practical outworking of the law of karma, a positive side to the law of karma. I mean, Jesus talked about building up to yourselves treasure in heaven. That's what he meant. He was talking about positive karma, about altruism, about living a life of service and helping of other people without looking or expecting any reward. I mean, if you do it for a reward, well, and you get a reward, well, then the whole thing is flattened out, isn't it? And Jesus said in another place, it's when you suffer unjustly that you win the brownie points. Didn't use those words, but it's effectively what he said. When you suffer unjustly and you take it well, and you don't allow yourself to become embittered and cynical and unpleasant as an individual, then you win a reward. There's positive karma as well as negative karma. And this is a tremendous, tremendous personal challenge that Theosophy makes to anyone who comes to Theosophy, to live the life of altruism. And a lot of people are not prepared for it, or even willing to go down that road. Sometimes I hear Theosophy criticised for being highly academic and intellectual. That's because people don't want to look at the other side of Theosophy and consider it. But it's there. And as I said, Blavatsky used the word altruism as an alternative word for Theosophy, in so much did she believe in that. And certainly her own life was a life of total service in trying to get the message across to the rest of humanity, because she saw what enormous benefits it had. And then again, there's this contrast between what people think Jesus taught and what he actually taught, because this idea of God being a terrible judge and on the last day punishing people and sending them to heaven or hell. But in fact, in St. John's Gospel, chapter 12 and verse 4, he says, "If a man sin, I do not judge him. The word that I have spoken will be his judge on the last day." If that isn't the law of karma, I don't know what is. If a man sins, I do not judge him, Jesus said. The word that I have spoken will be his judge on the last day. The law of karma. You haven't got to set up any sort of court in the case of the law of karma to actually execute it like you do in the civil courts of England, to execute the civil law, because the law of karma works totally automatically and irrevocably and reliably. There is this sense of automatic judgment. And so you can see how tremendously important attitude is. Attitude when we try and help somebody. We try and help them because we have sheer compassion for them, or because we think by helping them we're going to be helping ourselves in some way. And being sorry for doing something because we're scared of the consequences, or being genuinely sorry, regardless of the consequences. These attitudes are very subtle, but they're absolutely all-pervasive as far as the law of karma is concerned. And they're tremendously practical, because they impinge at the very heart of our lives and our growth as individuals into being more mature and rounded and developed spiritual beings. These are the parameters that are controlling our spiritual growth. And most of the time we try and ignore it and pretend it isn't there. And it's all to do with a misunderstanding about the nature of the law of karma. And in the Bhagavad Gita, it talks about the sacrifice. There's a whole section in the Bhagavad Gita about talking about sacrifice and saying when the sacrifice is acceptable and when it's unacceptable, and it puts down all sorts of detailed instructions about it. I mean, just to give you the way it puts it here, it says, and of course there is this other quote which is a favourite one from the Buddhist teachings, from the Dhammapada. I don't know whether you've read the Dhammapada. It's a fascinating little book, and this is a famous quote from the Dhammapada. "If a man speaks or acts with an evil thought, pain follows him as the wheel follows the foot of the ox that draws the carriage." The total inevitability of the law of karma painted in that beautiful little picture. If a man speaks or acts with an evil thought, pain follows him as the wheel follows the foot of the ox that draws the carriage. And Jesus said, "With the same measure that ye meet withal, it shall be measured to you again." How often you're surprised when you've done something helpful to somebody, to find that occasion arises, perhaps a few days or a few weeks or months later, when they have an opportunity to repay your kindness by doing a kindness to you. And you're surprised. You think, wow, fancy that person doing that for me. And then you think, well, yes, they must have really liked the fact that I helped them on some previous occasion. This strange sort of getting the same measure back that you give. If you give happily and in a loving, compassionate way, you may well get the same sort of treatment back. St. Paul says in the Epistle to the Galatians, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." Again, the law of karma in absolutely perfect words, contained in just a few words. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. But always remember that it involves attitudes of mind as well as actions. And here's the bit from the Bhagavad Gita that I was looking for. "A sacrifice is pure when it is an offering of adoration in harmony with the holy law, with no expectation of a reward, and with the heart saying, 'It's only my duty.' But sacrifice that is done for the sake of a reward, or for the sake of vainglory, is an impure sacrifice of Rajas. And a sacrifice done against the holy law, without faith and sacred words and the gifts of food and the due offering, is a sacrifice of darkness. Reverence for the gods of light, for the twice-born, for the teachers of the spirit and for the wise, and also purity, righteousness, chastity and non-violence, this is the harmony of the body. Words which give peace, words which are good and beautiful and true, and also the reading of sacred books, this is the harmony of words. Quietness of mind, silence, self-harmony, loving kindness and a pure heart, this is the harmony of the mind. This threefold harmony is called pure when it is practiced with supreme faith, with no desire for a reward, and with oneness of soul." Let me read that last verse again because it's so important. This threefold harmony is called pure when it is practiced with supreme faith, with no desire for a reward, and with oneness of soul. And of course, as you know, the Bhagavad Gita is the sort of pinnacle of the Hindu scriptures. I want to move into a slightly more contentious area now, but first of all I just want to draw your attention to the fact that that yoga and theosophy have got a lot in common. In fact, I came to the Theosophical teachings through belonging to a yoga class and studying and working in yoga. And here again, this question of treading the spiritual path is looked at from a yoga point of view. Yogi Ramacharaka writes in his book, Yoga Philosophy and Oriental Occultism, the yogis divide the path of attainment into 3 subpaths leading up to the main road. They call the 3 paths Raja Yoga, Karma Yoga and Gnana Yoga, each of these forms of yoga being a path leading to the great road, and each fit to be travelled by those who may prefer it, but all leading to the same place. Raja Yoga is the path followed by those who feel inclined to develop the powers latent in man, the gaining of the control of the mental faculties by the will, the attainment of the mastery of the lower self, the development of the mind, and to the end that the soul may be aided in its unfoldment. Karma Yoga is the yoga of work, the path of action, and Gnana Yoga is the yoga of wisdom. And then we move into this contentious religious area because he says, in addition there is Bhakti Yoga, or the yoga of devotion, the path of religious feeling. Some writers treat this path as if it were distinct from the other paths, a separate path, but we prefer thinking and teaching that it is merely an incident of each of the 3 paths, as we cannot conceive of any student of yoga divorcing his work from the love and devotion of the Absolute, to God. We fail to see how one may follow any of the several yoga paths without being filled with love and reverence for the great centre of all life. And there's a lady called Sylvia Cranston in America. I think she's died in the last year or two, but she set herself a task of writing a biography of Madame Blavatsky, which was much deeper and more penetrating than anything that had ever been written before, because over the years a lot of the letters that Blavatsky had written to her family had come to light and been translated into English from the Russian, and so she wrote this incredible book called The Extraordinary Life and Influence of Helena Blavatsky. And in this book she refers to a certain incident that occurred in Blavatsky's life. She had at some time had a friend by the name of Solovyov. Unfortunately, he was one of those friends who turns when he becomes displeased. He's also one of those men who thinks he can boss a woman around just because he's a man. And you can imagine the sort of fireworks that produced with when he tried to boss HPB around. And when he could not get his own way, in Sylvia's words, Solovyov then sought to make trouble for HPB and her own family. It began when inoculating Vera, HPB's sister, with the idea that Theosophy was antagonistic to Christianity. HPB advised Sinnett that Vera had written her a thundering letter calling me a renegade, a sacrilegious Julian the Apostate, and a Judas to Christ. Blavatsky replied to her, "It is evident that Solovyov is quite furious because he did not succeed in getting from me what he expected." Incidentally, he asked to be made to be introduced into the mysteries, into the occult mysteries, and she felt she couldn't introduce him into all the deeper mysteries of occultism because he wasn't fit for it. And he was absolutely furious. And he has invented the excuse of anti-Christianity. As for my anti-Christianity, you know what it is. I am an enemy of the ecclesiastical excesses of Protestants and Catholics. The ideal of Christ crucified shines for me every day, clearer and purer. I was absolutely astonished when I read those words. I didn't imagine that Blavatsky had really taken any great interest in Christianity and its interpretation of the crucifixion of Jesus. But she says, the ideal of Christ crucified shines for me every day, clearer and purer. And it's certainly true that no consideration of karma, of the law of karma, which is what I'm trying to do this evening, can really ignore this huge impact upon 2,000 years of world history that has been made by the way in which the early Christians interpreted the death of Jesus on the cross. Whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not, whether we accept the theology surrounding it or not, it has had the most huge impact upon the history of the world. And in order to try and resolve the huge problems that are generated by this, I want to quote from a little book by a very great member of the English section of the Theosophical Society. He was a High Court judge. He founded the Buddhist Society in London. His name was Christmas Humphreys. And he wrote a little book called The Search Within. It's a fascinating title. I'm sure you can imagine what he aimed at doing when he wrote that book with that title, The Search Within. And he says, constantly picture the universe as a living organism controlling a single substance and a single soul. And note how all things react upon a single world sense. All act by a single impulse, and all cooperate towards all that comes to pass. And mark the contexture, that's a mass of things woven together, and the concatenation, the union by linking together, of the web. And so we get the first glimmer here of the concept of the one life and the brotherhood. Because of this interrelatedness of all life, no man has been said so many times, hasn't it? No man is an island. We are interrelated, whether we like it or not. We couldn't exist entirely on our own. Certainly not in this climate we couldn't. We're totally interdependent on each other for our food and our protection and everything that makes up our lives. We're dependent on each other. And the result of this is that the action of any one life affects the whole. And I gave you some examples earlier in trying to explain what I meant by the karma being hierarchical. The more violent or powerful the action, the more likely is the whole web of life to be affected. Now, because I don't need you to tell you, it's been talked about so many thousands of times over the last 50 years, what an incredible impact Hitler had upon the history of the world by setting up his National Socialism and the Nazi movement. And so it distorted the web of human brotherhood. I mean, it was the total antithesis of brotherhood. What was National Socialism? The Aryan race was supreme, and because it was supreme, it was entitled to do what it liked with the other races, and was quite legitimate in what it was doing. Total antithesis of brotherhood, and so it distorted the web of human brotherhood, almost out of recognition, and it goes on with another quote to refer to the spider's web. I couldn't bring a spider's web into the lecture, could I? So I could draw you a spider's web, just to remind you how totally interrelated it is. It's a superb example of the interrelatedness of us all in our human lives, and the essentialness of recognizing universal brotherhood. Absolutely essential. And you know that if an insect lands on a spider's web, you've probably seen it. The insect, in struggling to get free, often tears the web and breaks it, and certainly almost every single strand of the web gets stretched or shrunk or broken in some way or another. The web is terribly distorted. The spider has to mend it. Now, you can find some light in looking upon the death of Jesus in that way, of restoring the web of human brotherhood, because he showed that love was stronger than hate. He said, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do," as they nailed him to the cross. The power of love was absolutely almost intolerable in the man. And he was somehow trying to show people that there was a way to restore the web of human brotherhood through love. And so we get a huge suggestion that God is love. Not that God is loving, but that God is love. Two entirely different things. He's the actual embodiment of love. And so it moves me into this area to talk about, with running fairly short of time, so I haven't got a lot of time left to finish, but I want to move into a different area. You can ask me a lot more about Jesus and the cross and all that if you want to in the question time, but I want to just move into this idea about God. A lot of people try and avoid it. They try and avoid it because it's an embarrassment. Do you believe in God? Well, yes, sort of. People who are really embedded in Christianity say, yes, I believe in God as described in the Bible. So you say, well, which of the gods described in the Bible do you believe in? Because the God described in the Old Testament isn't recognizable to the God that Jesus described in the New Testament. Which God are you talking about? And how is the God of Islam fundamentally different from the God of Christianity or Krishna in the Hindu religion? I mean, what are we trying to say about God? Is he some sort of superhuman being, and we put certain characteristics on him if he's if you're thinking about the Christian God, other characteristics if you're talking about the God of Islam, other characteristics if you're thinking about the God of the Jews of the Old Testament? I mean, what are we trying to do with this idea of God? I mean, are we just somehow playing with ideas about God that were embedded in our minds when we were children, and we've never really sort of sat down and analysed it and broken it down and looked at it properly, analytically, and tried to decide exactly what we do believe about God? Is he really some superhuman being in the sky who's going to one day judge us all? Is he really like that? Do you really believe that? Is there anyone in this room who really believes that? It's only a metaphorical question. You don't have to answer it. Now, this is where Theosophy really hits the heights, because it says, look, if there is an originating first cause for everything that exists throughout the whole universe, throughout the whole areas of mind and thought and intellect, throughout the whole world of spirit, if there's one fundamental first cause behind everything, is it possible that with our human brains we could begin to conceive of that being? Is it possible? Isn't it absolute rubbish to try and pretend that we can visualize God in any shape or form whatsoever? Yes, you can see the significance of saying God is love. You can see the power of love, and you can say, well, if that is an embodiment of the divine, yes, I can see that. Goodness, truth, and beauty are the three divine attributes, aren't they? Goodness, truth, and beauty, all highly abstract. Beauty only in the eye of the beholder, perhaps, or is there a fundamental, deep thing about beauty which is to do with the divine? And if it is, what sort of a God is there that you can visualize which displays these properties of goodness, truth, and beauty, and love? And so how does the ancient wisdom, the wisdom that goes back, we're told, through the earliest Hindu scriptures over, some people reckon, over 30,000 years before Christ, the same teaching, what does it say? It says the being that is behind all existence, whether you call him God or what, is totally unimaginable as far as we're concerned. Don't try to imagine God, because by doing so you just lead yourself into a completely false position. And so this first fundamental proposition, one of the three rocks upon which I said Theosophy was built at the start of this lecture, reads like this. Now just listen, I'll read it twice and I'll read it slowly, and think about what you believe about God as I read these words. An omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle, on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the power of human conception. It is beyond the range and reach of thought. Now, for me, that is where Theosophy hits the heights, because there it is giving me something which I feel has got the ring of truth about it, saying that if the originating first cause of all existence, of our lives and thoughts and spirituality and everything else, must be something that's defined like this. Let me read it to you again. An omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle, on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the power of human conception, beyond the range and reach of thought. Think about it. There's only one fundamental proposition that I haven't mentioned this evening, and that is all to do with reincarnation, because it says, the eternity of the universe in toto, as a boundless plain, periodically the playground of numberless universes, incessantly manifesting and then disappearing. The appearance and disappearance of worlds is like a regular tidal ebb of flux and reflux. What it's saying, basically, is that everything is cyclic, just as the tide goes in and out every day on the beach. couple of times. So everything is cyclic. The seasons come round. Everything comes round and does it again. Everything does, including the universe itself in its physical manifestation, although it takes billions and billions and billions of years to work itself right the way out and go out of existence and then come back in again. But the whole thing is cyclic. And it is upon this fundamental thought of cyclicity, of repeating the rhythm, that the whole concept of reincarnation really rests. That is where the whole concept of reincarnation. How can we possibly just be living this one single life? If we're on a process of gradual development and spiritual growth and development, surely it makes sense to say we do as much as we can in one lifetime, and then we live life again and try and build up a little bit stronger. And of course, as you know, the Buddhist teaching is very strong on that. They see our lives, in the plural, like a string of beads, a necklace, and that we're gradually completing this necklace, and eventually we would have achieved as much spiritual growth and development as is possible during an earth life, and we will move on to some other sphere. And the Dhammapada talks about reaching the land of never returning. Beautiful phrase. This idea that eventually your spiritual progress has to be pursued in another realm of existence because you've done all you possibly can with earth lives. And so the whole teaching of reincarnation isn't just a piece of dogma that's come out of the East, as some people think it is. But it's based upon this deep fundamental observation of nature, which is why I started this evening, that everything is cyclic. And how could our human lives be other than cyclic as well? Anyway, I've probably opened up a whole new field in those last few minutes for discussion, but I think I better stop there because I've actually just exactly had my hour. So I'll sit down and leave you to fire questions if you'd like to.
Questions? You were just talking about the psychic nature of reincarnation. One thought that comes to mind immediately is that the number of souls living on the planet now, exceeds drastically the number of souls that have previously been around. And it's a kind of mathematical thing, which is, where are all the souls coming from? Because there are probably more souls around now than there ever have been before. So you've introduced the notion of fresh incarnations.
Yes, I've heard various attempts to do the mathematics on this, and it requires a huge amount of guesswork about how many people lived in previous centuries, and whether, in fact, if you aggregate all the people who've ever lived upon the earth, it's a bigger number than the number who currently live on the earth now, or not. And so that there is some debate, and I don't think anyone has got reliable statistics to actually do the sums accurately.
If it were not the case that there were a constant stream of fresh souls coming into incarnation, you would have the hypothetical possibility of still births taking place on a large scale, because there wouldn't be enough new souls to take them.
Yes, there is the thought that what happens is that the one life is manifesting whenever it gets the opportunity, virtually capable of an infinitude of manifestations. Create the opportunity for. I only talked for 45 minutes because the tapes only didn't start at the beginning, did I? You create the possibility for consciousness to take hold in the physical realm, and consciousness will take hold, whether it's with an animal or a human being. What is so fascinating about the human being is that it's as though consciousness and complexity were directly linked, because the physical human body is by far the most complex mechanism that exists, to our knowledge, in the whole universe. We've built telescopes and put them on Hubble telescopes on spacecraft. We've built huge radio telescopes to study the radio spectrum of the universe. We've done everything we can to study the universe. We've built electron microscopes to look down into the smallest particles of matter. And we've found nothing that even begins to approach the complexity of the human body. We have got, although we treat it very badly at times, and we don't often think about it in those terms, we have got the most incredible gift in our human body, the most complex mechanism in the universe. And somehow it seems to be able to support a higher level of consciousness than we see anywhere else. That's the first of the two fascinating aspects of this business that you're raising. The second one is that, as far as we can see, no animal is able to exercise what I call self-consciousness, not in the sense of being embarrassed to stand up front, do play or something, but being self-aware. And
I think some people might dispute that, but I generally...
I don't think. I think if I put it to you in these terms, that you probably could find anybody who can be excluded from this definition. If you're cleaning your teeth or brushing your shoes or tying your tie, whatever you're doing, which is automatic, peeling the spuds, something that you've done hundreds of times, and your brain is able to sort of leave your hands to get on with it and go off somewhere else than thinking. And you sometimes find yourself thinking about something you don't want to think about. Perhaps there's been some terrible piece of news item that really horrified you, and you just don't want to think about it. And you suddenly find your mind thinking about it. And what do? You say to yourself, I don't want to think about this, I'll think about something else. And you deliberately take hold of your own thoughts and direct them into another channel. And I mean, this is a classic example, of course, is when you're a student. You want to listen to the radio, but you've got to do your studies, and you keep switching your mind back onto your studies and stop listening to the radio. I used to play a game at it when I was a student. I used to playing, listening to the radio, and then do a bit more study and flicking my thoughts backwards and forwards. I mean, this is an incredible illustration of the fact that we have another level of consciousness above the ordinary animal consciousness, which enables us to control our own thoughts. And I see that as a wonderful demonstration of the manifestation of the divine in the individual. That you're here talking about divine consciousness.
Would not it be possible that the only one level of consciousness of the animal would be another manifestation of the divine consciousness? In fact, that they are not divided in monkey mind, thinking about something else, but they are totally in tune with the divine universe, without questioning it or flicking from one level of thoughts, but they are just in tune with, they are just doing exactly what they were supposed to do, in tune with the divine, and they are exactly where they should be, doing what they should be, and we are not.
You're absolutely right in the sense that the whole business about the individual person growing spiritually is about resonating with divine consciousness. This is about raising our own individual consciousness so that it vibrates with the divine. I'm sure you've all must have at some time in your lives heard the chorus that's sung in some parts of the church. The chorus is the children sing. Let the Spirit of Jesus be seen in me. This idea of actually raising the level of spirituality and performance of a life to resonate with the divine, as it did with Jesus. You see, there's this sense of portraying goodness, truth and beauty and divine love in a human life, as Jesus did, and trying to rise to that sort of level of spiritual maturity. And of course it can be absolutely unbearable. I mean, the people who disliked him found it absolutely unbearable because he was so spiritually advanced and vibrating. And Buddha was exactly the same. Buddha had this same raising of his consciousness so that it resonated with divine consciousness. And that really says it all in a way.
Yes, for me that resonance with the divine is non-divided. There is no questioning, it's just pure harmony. So I would say that what we need to raise to a level of pure harmony is by stopping to questioning things so much and going with the flow. But it might be just what I think, honestly. Yeah. Like Christ said, become like a child. The little children are the ones who can go to the thing. But children usually, they don't question too much things because they haven't had. Except, of course, if we think reincarnation, a child might be old soul, and then, well,
I think he meant. I think when he said be like a child, he meant be guileless.
There's something immensely appealing about having a kind of natural innocence, like the animal kingdom. But I think that our destiny is to actually be self-conscious and strive to combine the consciousness with nature, separate the two.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and you see, this whole question of immortality and what carries on from one life to the next all comes into play if you pursue this particular line of thought, because if it's your own particular personality that carries on, which is largely affected by the way you were treated as a child, what sort of genes you inherited from your parents, whether you've got stomach ulcers and goodness knows what else, whether you're irritable and so on. All sorts of reasons could be generating your personality, but your true spiritual nature is a different ballgame, and that's the part that is seen as having the capability of immortality. Now, the thing about the manifestation, which is where you started with your first question, is that the idea of an infinite variety of manifestation is there. Because in this first fundamental proposition, there's the word boundless and immutable principle. That there's the idea that whatever opportunity there is to manifest, the divine will manifest. I mean, if there's a Beethoven who is capable of putting down a certain type of music, then the divine will manifest through the Beethoven or the Mozart, because there is an opportunity for manifestation. It looks as though the divine is looking for every opportunity to manifest in whatever way it possibly can. And so if you've got more people living in the world today than have lived throughout the whole of history, including going back to the very earlier civilizations that got destroyed by some cataclysmic process, you know, the Atlanteans and so on. If you add all that together, and it doesn't amount to the number of people living today, it isn't really a problem, because the divine will go on manifesting however many babies are conceived in the world.
I've just got a question related to reincarnation. Just had a realisation that I suppose the animal kingdom lives in harmony with itself, and perhaps in the 20th century world populations exploded, and probably because it's exploded is we're reliving karma from the fact that we've lost our way of spirituality. So we're reinventing ourselves to make the mistakes, to relive our karmic reaction, so that ultimately we all get on the path of spirituality, rather than sort of invent new ways to destroy ourselves and nature.
I agree with every word you said. Absolutely, totally. Hey, I think you put it very well.
And it's part of the cycling, the cycle. As
cycle.
an evolution, we are in full blast cycle of evolution, which might have happened many a times. We don't know how old the...
I mean, I think it's the biggest reason for living as long as possible and keeping your marbles as long as possible. Because you go through all this business of babyhood and going to infant school and you know, having to study and all the rest of it before you reach adulthood. Once you've got it, you know, make use of it as long as possible and live as long as possible to make use of it. You know, and not have to keep coming back and doing the babyhood game so many times. You know, I think there's a lot to be said for trying to look after yourself so that you live to a ripe old age and get all the advantages.
One of the greatest gifts we have as a species is curiosity.
Pardon?
Curiosity. To be curious.
Oh,
to be
curious.
About
Yes.
the
Yes.
next thing that is
Yes.
going to happen.
Yes.
One of our blessings, actually.
Absolutely, yes. The person who's curious is alive, definitely. Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I always said that there were some people who came into the research lab where I worked and they couldn't stand the work. They left within a year, many of them. They couldn't stick it, because in order to do research, you have to have an insatiable curiosity to drive you forward. Your boss can't tell you to do research. You're either driven to it from within, or you can't do it. You know, curiosity is the great driving force for mankind. Really, I agree with you entirely. Absolutely. Whoa, lots of hands. Yes.
Madame Blavatsky, in line with the teachings of Alice Bailey?
Well, Alice Bailey claims to have been... Yeah, Alice Bailey claims to have been instructed by the masters, just in the way that Blavatsky was instructed by the masters. And by and large, I'm not a great student of Alice Bailey. There are one or two people in the room who might be able to say more of that. But I mean, basically, it seems to me, from my sort of distant view of Alice Bailey's teachings, that she doesn't fundamentally disagree with the basic philosophy of Blavatsky's teaching, but she goes into a huge amount of detail, which Blavatsky never goes into, and expands it. And there are a lot of people in the Theosophical movement who don't think that Alice Bailey really was instructed by the masters. There are others who think she was. And it's a typical example of having brotherhood within a society where people don't all think the same thing. I mean, people don't all think the same thing in a Theosophical society by any means. I mean, I don't suppose there's two people in this room this evening who think exactly the same theosophically. And many of you will have agreed with a great deal of what I've said this evening, and some of you won't have agreed with things that I've said, because your view of theosophy is obviously slightly different, or majorly different from mine. But we're all but it doesn't affect the fundamental brotherhood. And one of the most fascinating things that I found when I came into the Theosophical Society, which I mean I've only been in for 16 years, I haven't been in that long compared to some people, was that no one ever argued, whatever religious orientation they had, or wherever they came from in atheism or whatever, they never argued about it in the Theosophical Society. And it's incredible.
The idea of ascended masters.
Yes.
Well,
LSPD supposed to believe in.
Well, I mean, in Blavatsky, there's this idea that the masters don't live forever. I mean, in the Mahatma letters, the masters say that they are able to carry their consciousness over unbroken from one incarnation to the next, but they don't always do it. And there's plenty of evidence that many of them, I think, are dead now and are ascended. And how much they can influence. Pardon?
This is in the esoteric sense.
Yeah.
The ascended master.
Would there be would there be a similarity between the notion of the Akasha, which was the global knowledge that is accessible, and the notion of ascended masters? Because if the Akasha is the sum of all knowledge that can be accessed by humankind, we don't really need ascended masters. We can all receive it.
Yes, it's not really as simple as that, is it? You see, it's much more complicated because you say, well, the astral light is everywhere. The Akashic records are a total record of all that's ever happened and is happening, and therefore, why shouldn't everybody be able to access it? Because it's a question. I mean, in this room, let's take a real practical example of what I'm trying to say. In this room, you all know there are probably a couple of dozen television signals and umpteen radio signals, and if you get the right piece of equipment driven by batteries, not connected to anything, and stand it down in the middle of the room, you can tune it into a whole range of television stations or radio stations. Because they're all in this room and you can't see any of them. It's all a question of tuning. It's all a question of tuning. And it's all a question of tuning as far as the Akashic records, the Akasha, the astral light, all of these things, it's a question of a tuning. Why are some people psychic and not others? Because some people are able to tune into the astral and some others aren't. That's where the key is to understanding.
My next question is a cyclic movement.
What's that? Sorry, I missed the beginning.
And we all, as a species, as cycle goes, at the point of tuning. In fact, we are going to all, because we are also interested by the same thing, and there are so many people in the world that are interested into spiritual evolution, and we all going to the point where we're going to be tuning in what we can receive as a species.
Anyone can turn a knob on a radio set to tune it, but not everyone can climb Everest. No. You see, you've got to fulfil all sorts of tremendously demanding spiritual conditions in order to tune in to some of these levels that you're talking about, and you may not even be, it may take you several lifetimes to be able to tune into that level that you're trying to access.
But now, as a species, and we all reach the point that through karmic reincarnation after reincarnation, because it is needed for the movement forward of the planetary evolution, and we all going to be able to tune in now. Because in fact, I do believe that there is a big movement of evolution that we are full blasting it. And if we don't tune it as a species, there is a fair chance we are not going to be there for a very long time, planetary-wise. I mean, we might go to other planet incarnation.
I think it's very possible that it is. And you see, one of the great things about the teaching, which is identical with the teaching of Christianity and Hinduism and Buddhism, is that you cannot assume immortality. You cannot assume it. You cannot assume that you're going to go on. There are you can nosedive and go out of existence because you have to fulfill certain conditions, and in the Mahatma letters Synod had asked KH, one of the writers of the letters, to do something, and KH says, I couldn't possibly do that because the thing that he'd been asked to do. He said, I couldn't possibly do that because if I did, I would put at risk my hard-won immortality. So this idea that because I've said that we live cycles, we go through lots of reincarnations, I'm not suggesting that you automatically have immortality. It's a very complex subject. In fact, you need a whole lecture on it. I mean, I couldn't spend the... Pardon?
Who would want immortality if it's not to be in tune with the divine on the planet? My personal choice would certainly not be immortality if the whole planet is not there.
If someone told you that when you go to bed tonight and go to sleep, that you'll never wake up again, would you be remotely bothered?
Probably not. I'd be curious. I'd be extremely curious where I could be going then. If I don't go anywhere off, if I go somewhere fascinating.
Well, it's worth thinking about.
There are some people who say, depending on which philosophy, which spiritual path you're on, there are some people who would say we are living in a degenerate time. Converse to Sylvie, who is suggesting that we are evolving spiritually. But are we? And if we're just going in cycles, has it ever been thus? And if you study history,
well,
where are we going?
Yeah.
Are we just going round and round in circles? What is the purpose of our existence? What's it for?
Well, take history. To take your first point, the question of history. If you had been born more than 300 years ago, you probably would have been totally uneducated. You wouldn't be able to read or write, and you'd just be used as a body, as a slave to work the fields and the farm. And you wouldn't, the idea of abstract thought or being able to engage in the sort of discussions that we're having here this evening would be totally impossible. Now, it's only with the mass education being introduced into society, where every child gets an education and the opportunity to read and write and develop their mind, that we've been able to latch on to a higher level of evolvement and development. I mean, you know, if you were just a serf and you were going to church because you were told to every Sunday and listening to what the priest said was written in the Bible because you couldn't read it for yourself, and you just accepted what was told you because you had no yardstick by which to judge what you were told, as whether it was true or false, or whether it was half true and half false. You know, you didn't hardly existed. That incarnation hardly did anything for you spiritually. But now, with everyone being educated and the opportunity now in a world where there's freedom of thought as there's never been, there's no persecution now.
Unless you live in a third world country.
Well, yes.
Not only that,
unless you're a child slave or whatever.
Yes, but
it depends where you are.
The whole of human progress is hierarchical as well, isn't it? I mean, we have to talk about where the highest point is. We know that there's always a baseline where there are underprivileged people who don't get educated and who are.
So are we progressing?
You know, so I think we're progressing.
So there's hope.
I think there's nothing like the bigotry. I don't think there's anything like the bigotry that there used to be years ago.
Do you agree with Alice Bailey when she says we are coming to the end of a 2,000-year cycle, and the old order is giving way to the new order?
The courage.
Well, I just don't know. I just don't know. I think she's expressing an opinion, but whether she's speaking with great master authority or not, I prefer to sit on the fence and say maybe she is being inspired by some great ascended master, maybe she isn't. But I'm not prepared to really say one way or the other whether she is. I just don't know. All I will say, and I think this is a tremendously important point, and that is that if something has for you personally a ring of truth about it, take hold of it and grab it. Because in the end, it's what in yourself, inside yourself, seems to be true that is important. For most of my life, I just accepted Christianity and Christian theology and the teachings of the Bible totally, and although it had conflicted in some ways with my professional scientist profession, I put up with it. And then I met Theosophy. And suddenly I saw that it was a huge wide screen that I'd never imagined. When I was in my early 20s, there was a show came on in the West End called Cinerama, I think it was. And you sat down in the cinema, and there was an ordinary sized screen in black and white. And as you sat there, it changed into colour. It was still an ordinary sized screen. And then suddenly, they started to roll back the curtains. And the screen got wider and wider and wider and wider until it was at the limits of your vision. And then they put you on a roller coaster. I mean, you really felt you were on a roller coaster, because the whole of your input, your hearing and your sight was dominated by the inputs from the screen and the auditorium. And that illustrates how I felt when I came to Theosophy. Suddenly reading the Proem to the Secret Doctrine, as I said earlier, and grasping hold of these teachings, the whole width of understanding of the nature of truth and existence expanded for me by orders of magnitude. Incredible.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Coming to this question of is the self is important, your own truth.
Individual self. Yeah.
And this hierarchical race, more here, more here. Isn't it important also to stress that the impact of any particular karma initiated by your thoughts or actions
Absolutely.
have a different impact according to which level you're at?
Oh yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And that then is fair and just, because we shouldn't be speaking about retribution or punishment or reward, because it's all a matter of training.
Yeah.
The purpose of karma is training.
Yes.
And we repeat it and go in the same situation if you don't learn that year's lesson.
Jesus said, beware, to whom much is given, much will be required. Of him, much will be required. And you're absolutely right, you can't escape it. The more you're given, the more you're expected to produce in your lifetime. If you're not given much, you can't be expected to produce much. The man who was given 10 talents was expected to produce 10 more. The man who was given 1 talent was still expected to produce 1 talent, and he didn't do it, and he got censored for it. You know, the teachings are absolutely crystal clear.
And
Crystal
each karmic situation is unique to each individual act and thought.
Absolutely.
So we're all in different places. But
We are. We're all at different stages of spiritual development and evolution, and the whole process. You know, this is what this fundamental identity of all souls, the universal oversoul, and the pilgrimage through the cycle of incarnation is all about. It's this going through this cycle and hopefully making some use of it. Now, some people, you can see by just looking at their lives that they've wasted their time incarnating at all, because they've just achieved nothing. You really can.
But that's the judge of karma.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, maybe they were maybe they've got lots of excuses because they were terribly underprivileged and badly treated as children, and goodness knows what else. But in the end, did they make any progress or not in a whole lifetime?
Well, that's because there's free will, of course.
Yes. Free will.
And predestination, double predestination.
Yes, yeah. Predestination and free will. Yes. Well, of course, if you've read, and Calvin and so on and so forth.
Can I make a quick point? Can I make a very basic point?
Yes, do. Yes. All 4 basic
It's
points.
all very interesting, but you said something earlier which rang true to me. You said, I don't know. How can we be absolutely sure about anything? All this, I'm serious now, I'm absolutely serious. We're all waffling on all sorts of things. You might be absolutely right. But are you wrong? We talk about divinity, karma, reincarnation, all this stuff. How does anybody know any of it? Now maybe there are ways of gaining knowledge, and you can be absolutely certain about it. But as I get older, I get certain about less and less.
Well,
You're coming into wisdom then.
there are 2 things. There are 2 things. The first one, that even St. Paul said, if we're wrong, we are of all men the most miserable. Because it was flashed across even St. Paul's mind that he might be totally wrong about the whole thing. And he says that, you know, if we are wrong, we're of all men the most miserable. It's there in the Bible. But the thing is that you cannot be certain about anything subjective in the same way that you can be certain about something that is in a law in the physical world. You have to be certain. I mean,
how much of all this is conjecture and guesswork? That's the point I'm making.
Well,
if you're honest, totally honest.
Yes. Well, the answer that Theosophy gives to that question is that the teachings that are put forward by Theosophy have been presented by countless seers and mystics down through the whole of human history. Unlike most of the religions of the world, which have been presented in fairly recent times compared with the history of the world and of the human race on the world, but that these teachings have been honed and considered and weighed and thought about and studied by countless seers and mystics, and that they have the ring of truth only really because of their antiquity. Well, you could say that men have always been wrong. You could, and you'd be perfectly entitled to say that.
I wouldn't say they're wrong. I might suspect that.
Go for it, George.
When you go to a funeral, or you sit by someone as they're dying, you somehow feel the existence of another world. At least I do, and I think you can only say that in your own personal experience, you are convinced that there's a spiritual side to life as well as a physical side. But in the end, no one can prove it to anybody else. They're
all groping, really.
Let me give you an example of how impossible people find it to believe anything. When Michael Faraday had discovered the laws of electromagnetism, he was a member of the Royal Society, the supreme scientific body of the land. And he went along to the other members of the Royal Society and he said, I've got some experiments in my laboratory which show that there is a law of electromagnetism which has huge potentiality. And they said, oh, I don't believe it. She said, well, come to my laboratory and I will demonstrate it to you. So, they went to his laboratory in London, it was somewhere. The whole of the Royal Society, the members of the Royal Society. And they said, oh, no, you're wrong, Michael Faraday. You're wrong. It's not like that. You're producing some effect, but the way you're interpreting it is totally wrong. They wouldn't believe him at all. And he'd actually using the fundamental laws of electromagnetism that we use to run our society today, that run our electric motors, that generate our electricity in the power stations. And it was stalemate. Nothing happened. And then Maxwell came along as a mathematician, and he proved mathematically that Michael Faraday's laws were correct. And because no one could argue with the mathematics, Maxwell's mathematics, they accepted the laws of electromagnetism, and our modern society became a possibility. We wouldn't have the motor car, the television, the electric light, the electric train. We wouldn't have anything if that hadn't happened. It was all down to Michael Faraday. And you see, that is the degree of scepticism that exists in the human mind, that it won't even accept the evidence presented in the laboratory, because it thinks there's a trick somewhere, there's some other explanation. Oh no, that's not the explanation, there's another one. So in the end, it comes down to your actually having to make your own mind up as to whether you agree that something is true or false. And everyone has to do it for themselves. No one can do it for you.
Can I say of an experience that I had?
Yes, do.
When I was very near death. And the people that are around me, doctors and nurses, they went into shadows.
For this lady, it's knowledge.
Exactly.
Yes, yeah.
All esoteric, all knowledge is esoteric in that sense.
Yes, it
You
is.
have to decide for yourself.
Well, it's personal experience, isn't
Yeah,
it? You
but
can't pass it
you
on.
can't answer. You do it for yourself. Yes, you could be wrong, but that's for you to decide.
Take Newton's law of gravity. Now, that science accepted Newton's theory about gravity and the mathematical interpretation of gravity that he gave with his theory. for a couple of centuries at least. And no one ever doubted that there was anything wrong about Newton's law of gravity until astrophysics came along. And then they found that there was something missing, that it wasn't the whole truth. It was part of the truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. Now, we're not in a game of saying things are black and white, that they're either true or false. We're in a game all through life of shades of grey. And if we've got hold of part of the truth, but we're partly in error, well, so be it. But if we've got hold of part of the truth and something we've heard or something we've come to understand or believe has the ring of truth about it for us, then we should hold on to it and lock on to it, because until someone can actually disabuse us of it. Because, I mean, that, as you say, is like a personal experience. And that's the way I've experienced it through life.
What do you regard thought as a subtle form of energy? Because I've prayed for people and I've seen the difference.
Yes, well, people I've come across many cases of people in hospital who said they felt that they were being prayed for as they lay in the hospital bed.
Energy.
So
There's an energy.
there's an energy. There's all sorts of energies. Yeah, psychic energy as well as.
Yeah, unless it is very
calories.
beautiful and very positive, we can believe in it anyway. We don't need to question it. We just go with it. Go with the flow of that energy that we believe and trust in.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to be ever disproved, because the more we believe in it, the stronger it will become. And I think it's part of our karma to believe in it.
Well, yes. I mean, you've made a very good point, which I'd like to develop a little bit, because you see, you take the divine attributes of goodness, truth, and beauty. Go down and walk through the countryside and see a wonderful, beautiful view, or look out to sea across a beautiful bay, like we've been doing. Cornelia and I have been doing Gower this weekend, and you see the beauty there. And it's an attribute of the divine. You don't have anybody to tell you that it's beautiful. You know it's beautiful because you see for yourself it's beautiful. You see someone, you meet someone who is obviously tremendously honest. You can see the honesty of the person in their face, and you think to yourself, that person would never lie to me, because I can see what an honest person they are. You see the ring of truth in that person. You know, goodness, when people are really good people, it shows in their faces. When they're not, it also shows in their faces, unfortunately. You know, these divine attributes are not really up for debate. You know when you see them. And so you recognise the divine. You recognise the divine attributes.
We're going to have to stop the questions now.
Yes, okay.
Because the refreshments are ready. Is that okay?
Well, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Although we extinguish the light of this candle, our vision remains bright, our fellowship warm, and our yearning for peace, justice, and the life of the Spirit constant. So may it be until we meet again. I want to thank you for attending, and to let you know that the next talk will be Astral Travel and Awareness at the same place on October the 23rd. If you would like to join the new study group, or if you have any more questions, then please see Nigel or myself over refreshments downstairs. And I'd also like to remind you that there are Theosophy books and tapes for sale, and they are for sale today only. So please, if you'd like to take advantage of those, would you like to do so? Thank you very much indeed, Colin, for coming in, for speaking to us.
It's a pleasure.
It's been marvellous.
Good.
Thank you.